Are there deep structures in Scripture that tie different parts together? Join me with my guest, one of my favorite people in the world, Dr. Joshua Berman. He's an Israeli scholar of the Hebrew Bible, also a rabbi, as we talk about how he discerns the deep structures of Scripture, how he ties things together, both thematically and linguistically. And we actually walk through a series of passages together. And I'm going to do the same thing with John Walton. Some of you may know him, an Old Testament scholar in the United States from Wheaton College. We're going to walk through the same passages of Scripture in a separate episode, and you can compare and contrast how they answer. Stay tuned.
This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
I've heard you, I think you're the first person who used the phrase deep structures in Scripture, or deep structures in the biblical literature, which really stuck with me. In fact, I think I use it now in your honor as how I think about the Bible. What do you mean by deep structures, and how do you find them without, dropping mines deep into the waters to blow up and see what floats to the top? How do you find deep structures? Yeah.
Wow. I mean, I think if you come to the biblical text as I do, with a sympathetic view of its unity. By that I mean within a book, and even from book to book, that whether the entire Bible was written by a single agent or not, that's not the issue, but rather that there is a kind of cultural continuity and a literary continuity, and that these works are reverberating and influencing and being deliberately invoked from one generation, from one passage, from one book to another, gives us the inevitable result that there will be patterns that appear over and over. And then once you are committed or open to viewing the Bible in that way, they really begin to jump out at you. So, I might take as an example, famine followed by abandoning the land and then returning to the land. So this is Abraham, and then this is the Jewish people, as one example. My doctoral dissertation advisor, Ed Greenstein, Professor Ed Greenstein, a great scholar, notes that the motif of the abandoned hero, like a hero who has to run away from where he was born and then come back, that's Jacob, that's Moses, that's David. This comes up over and over again. Or prophetic call narratives, that a person who's going to be a spiritual leader of the people, usually a prophet, has some type of epiphany and a struggle with the task that he's given. Comes up again and again, and often it's not only motival, issues of motif that recur, but if you are proficient in the Hebrew, then you see deliberate echoing of terms. And again, within a book, from book to book. And this just becomes a very rich way of reading. I think that this was, this is far less prevalent in modern literature, because I think that in biblical times, they had to find a way to get the biggest bang for the buck. What do I mean by that? They weren't able to publish a big fat book like this. You know what I mean? So if people are, if the assumption was at least that learned people were proficient in the stories, then they would have this repository of terms and of motifs that they would quickly access every time they saw something similar. Just by saying a single word, suddenly it's like you open a whole window to that earlier story. That goes on in wholesale fashion all across the Bible.
Yeah, one of those words for me would be fruitful. Whenever I see pri, right, it
No question.
fires off lots of
Yeah.
triggers.
Mm-hmm.
What would be some for you?
Oh wow! Well, it's usually what association does a particular word have? It might not be one word that appears from place to place. There are other motifs that I mentioned before, but it's inevitable if I'm reading a passage and there's a word there that is somewhat striking, and it only appears in a couple of other places. I'm beginning to think about what connection
Right.
is being made here? Yeah.
Yeah, it strikes me too that the Torah tends to use a more limited vocabulary, and at least in the narrative passages, where where the Psalms kind of expand, the poetic material expands the vocabulary. I know Robert Alter used to complain about this, that these stories are famously laconic, and also he would complain that English translators essentially did this disservice by constantly rendering synonyms in English rather than just showing it just says dirt every single time.
Right.
It's just
This is one of the great advantages to his commentary, that he is careful to preserve the same root in the Hebrew across its various usages. He will do that in the English. The inevitable sacrifice is that it might not read as smoothly, but if you are looking for these types of connections between stories, between passages, you'll find that in his translation. Some say prior to Alter, the translation that did this the best was the King James Version, actually, which is pretty consistent in how it translates things.
If you speak Elizabethan English as well, that helps.
Okay.
In the which is difficult for some people. So when you're, I think there's a distinct advantage. Not only do you read Hebrew, but you speak it natively. I wonder, as an Israeli, if you ever find that interferes, where the modern sense is you feel like you might be projecting, or you have that fear?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of words that I have to tell my class, folks, this doesn't mean what you think it means. Okay. I'll give you just one example of that. Okay. There's a Hebrew word, chesed, often translated into English as a kindness. Often it'll be translated, I think, even in English translations of the standard English translations of the Bible, God's grace or kindness with us, his chesed. In modern Hebrew, to do a good deed for another person is called an act of chesed. But in the Bible, it really means to be loyal. It really means to be loyal. Yeah.
Yeah, and so chesed in modern Hebrew is more like a mitzvah.
An act of kindness, an act of grace, to use a Christian term, but that's really what it is. But not in the biblical Hebrew, and that's always a fascinating thing, like to uncover, what it meant, why it meant that, why things changed. I love it. That's like fun stuff. Always fun stuff.
I mean, it's interesting. When I first became a Christian, kind of out of a non-Christian background, I had a very weird relationship with Christianity. But I started reading the Bible, and I was going to a church, and they talked about grace this, and that's God's grace, and grace that. I could not figure out what this word meant, because it was used so many different ways in what we call Christianese, right? So when I discovered cheres and chesed, well, in Greek, and you get the ch beginning at the beginning of both of those. It was very you could actually trace the trajectory, the connotation, the denotation. These are being used in very specific ways.
Drew, I have to stop. I want to throw something in, and if it works for the podcast, you'll keep it in, okay?
Okay.
So we at Bar Ilan, we have an overseas program, an overseas MA program that draws largely Christian students from across the globe. And I love it when they give a reading of the text. that I know I would not have thought of, and that it's coming from their Christian theological orientation without anything necessarily Christological to it.
Right.
But I had recently one such example. We were studying 2 Samuel, chapter 9, where David feels this deep need to satisfy the covenant or play or fulfill his role in his covenant with Jonathan, who's no longer alive, by doing right by Jonathan's lame son, Mephibosheth. And a student of mine from Costa Rica, Christian student, he said to me, yes, David here is taking the grace that he got from God in chapter 7, when God said to him, I am building for you a kingdom. And so now David feels the need to give the gift onward. And he's doing that, therefore, for Mephibosheth. I thought that's beautiful. And that comes from that student's Christian understanding of divine grace in a way that we don't really have, I have to say, in Judaism.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have almost the equal and opposite problem where I'm trying to get them to quit bringing their theological insights in because they're constantly over-reading theology in the text. But that is actually a good, I would call that a restrained interpretation.
It was good.
Yeah, that's great. Excellent. So those are examples of kind of linguistic issues that we can that being a native Hebrew speaker, you have to deal with those on an interesting way, which no English speaker has to deal with. I wonder on the flip side, how much an English-only audience, I mean, this would be true of Spanish-only, somebody who has no access to the original languages, because you work with a lot of Christians, both in Israel and other places. You've taught a lot of Christians. Where do you find them kind of faltering a little bit when they're stuck in their own translation and they don't really understand how the Hebrew works?
Well, I mean, I often, I'll tell you a way that I love to teach. I think everybody should be teaching this way today, honestly, especially in an age where our attention span is ever shrinking. I love to begin a lecture by giving my students the text or a piece of the text that we're going to be focusing on, and I split them into study pairs. Or this is what we do in the yeshiva. Before the lecture on a piece of the Talmud, students will pair off and read the material together and think about it. Sometimes they're given guiding questions by the lecturer, and then they come to class super prepared and super loaded, and then the discussions just explode, and they're amazing. So I will often give the students, an assignment to read the text, and they read the texts in their native languages. And then, I might draw oftentimes, how is this being translated in your Korean translation? How is this being translated in your Spanish? And then they say, oh, and then we see that it's different. And then that's a great way to talk about, whatever key word there is determining the text. Yeah.
Do they, when you have this chavruta, would it be chavrutot system, I guess? Does it ever get as noisy as it does in a yeshiva?
Oh, no. They're too inhibited. So I don't know, a little bit. Sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
It's they don't just talk about the passage. They argue about the passage. Right?
Yeah.
Which gives you great insights. Okay, I want to put you into conversation with a few passages and hear how you think through them. And again, thinking maybe a little bit more macroscopically than microscopically about what these passages are doing, how they function in the biblical literature. And I think feel free you don't have to say what different scholars have said. You can just say what you think is going on in these passages and why. And I'm sure you probably have various layers that you think about these passages. But going back to that issue of the unity of the text and unity within a book, I think most people, even English readers, when I walk them through, they see Genesis as a clear problem on this front, because you read Genesis 1 through 11, and it feels very different than the rest of the book. And then sometimes if they're really reading closely and asking questions, they feel like the end of the book feels very different as well with the Joseph narratives. And so you get this kind of natural breaking up into three parts. So without, you don't have to make an argument for unity, but how do you see something like Genesis 1 through 11 functioning, and what's the structural elements that you see played out elsewhere?
Wow. I mean, what's so interesting is that as many have noted, you can divide up Genesis by the opening phrase "Ele toldot X." These are the descendants of X, and that coinage, that phrase appears already, I believe, in chapter 2, and then appears another 4 or 5 times at the beginning of different intersections throughout the book. So that in no way takes away from the very accurate observation that you made, Dru, that, wow, just generically the genre of 1 to 11 seems different than later. And the Joseph novella seems to have a style of its own. There might be some stylistic differences, and I think other differences too. But this is where, again, my own predilection for viewing unity comes in. Here, I'll give you another example from within Genesis that shows me that it's really all unified. When in chapter 48, when Joseph brings his sons to Jacob for blessing, if you know the Hebrew well, and you've read Genesis really well, then what you can see is that entire narrative, right? It's the famous story. Jacob is now old and blind. Joseph brings his 2 sons. Jacob doesn't really know who's who and puts his hands out, and then Joseph has to switch the hands and tell him who's the older and who's the younger, and then the aged patriarch bestows his blessing and departs this world. That whole narrative of Genesis 48 is rife and replete with allusions to every scene of blessing earlier in the book of Genesis in perfect reverse order. As if this is like the culmination of all those different stories of blessing.
Can you give us a teaser? So how is it connected to maybe one? I mean, because there would be an obvious connection to another old man who is dying.
Yes. Okay. So that's one of them. But I'm just saying, like the words here. I'm just opening.
Oh yeah, the actual words themselves. Yeah.
It's the words. Yes. It's all in the words of the Hebrew. Yeah. I mean, some of the images too, but the words. Yeah. The words. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me see. Just find it. I'll edit out the page turning here. 1 second.
This is live.
Yeah, right.
Go there myself.
Yeah, so starting with Israel, who sits up in his bed, that's just like Isaac did, and Isaac was blind.
Right.
Phrases like El Shaddai appeared to me in Luz in the land of Canaan. I'm at the end of verse 3, and he said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply, and I will give you multiple nations. Well, those all echo earlier blessings in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beginning in chapter 1, God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply."
Yeah.
And then continuing in the Abrahamic covenants.
Yeah. Or Bicharbi uvekashti. Where does he say that? With my sword and my bow. Hold on. Yeah. So, like what it says here, the very last verse of 48, and I shall give them an extra portion above their brothers, which I took from the Amorites with my sword and my bow. Okay, you see that? 48:22, with my sword and my bow. But when you look in the stories of Ishmael is the one who has a sword and who has a bow. And so when Jacob says, my sword and my bow, he is appropriating, co-opting the blessing which had initially been for Ishmael is now his blessing. Things like that.
Yeah. And maybe even reinforcing the word to Rebecca, which the older shall serve the younger. There,
Mhm.
yeah, it's beautiful, and I think you're making the case here that superficially there's different things going on in these three different parts of Genesis, but as you look under the hood, you see all these
Mhm.
strands that seem to be
Mhm.
pulling from the very very beginning all the way
Mhm.
through.
Mhm.
What do you make of that just functionally? Like, why? Like,
Why what?
why all of these threads that, like, why when you look deeper it's an interwoven tapestry, but what's the point of that, if you think about for the reader, what does that do for us?
So as I say, I think on one level, it's the way in which the author is able to communicate a huge amount of ideas in very few words, because not everything needs to be spelled out. I just say, oh, sword, bow, and it's up to you to then, know, oh, he's just opened the Ishmael window. Aha. Okay, so I think that's one aspect of it.
Hmm.
And I think that maybe there's a deeper theological meaning. This is a musing that I'm doing on the spot, but
Right.
a musing that in all of reality, there's kind of the surface of what you see, but then maybe there are things that are going on underneath that are deeper, that cross space and time. That maybe God's hand works in such a way as well.
Huh.
It's part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, even human relationship, there's always something going on under the hood.
Okay. There you are.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's great. Okay, we're off to a great start. I love this issue, which I always say it's very economical writing, but that it really, this huge amount of information, it creates a world. It gives you some linguistic tools, and I always say nothing gets thrown to the side. So pay attention to every detail because it's going to come up
Mhm.
again and again and
Mhm.
again.
Mhm.
Um, and especially if you're talking about people who are hearing this text who aren't reading it as well, you actually need those linguistic tools to help
Mhm.
them kind
Mhm.
of even
Mhm.
track. And when people say, I read the Old Testament, but I got so bored, I would say, well, start listening to it and try to figure out what it means. And then you'll be thankful for the repetition.
Right.
The repetition
Right. What I
will help.
often do with I do this also with people who don't know a word of Hebrew. Like
Mm.
when I visit, Christian institutions, um, we'll take a little passage, a little narrative passage, and I will split them up into study pairs, chavrutot, as we say in the world of the yeshiva. And I'll say to them, I want you to read this passage together, the two of you, and I want you to each begin to ask each other questions about it.
Hmm.
And that slows down the reading, and that sharpens, getting people to notice things.
Excellent. Okay, so let's move on to another bit of parallelism, and parallelism at a very macro level, which is something like Sodom and Gomorrah, where you have a foreigner who comes into a village, and
Yeah.
then the entire village descends, all the men in the village descend in order to do violence to this foreigner, and then there's a noble person who knows what's going to happen and ushers them away. This happens in Genesis 19, and it becomes, even for Jesus, this becomes like the reason for judgment, what judgment is going to be like for this kind of evil. But then, Judges, like so many things in Judges, it just gets sadder and sadder and sadder. And then in Judges, it happens again, but it's Israelites this time who are doing it to a Levite. And again, the wording in the Hebrew, it's almost cut and paste at points.
Yep. Yep.
Almost the exact same words are used to construct
Yep.
these stories. So besides the obvious that the problem of Judges 19 is now the problem of Sodom and Gomorrah is now that kind of violence is in Judges 19. What do you make of that reuse of the actual language?
Yeah. So obviously, well, my assumption is that the book of Judges comes after the book of Genesis. If for no other reason, and this is an important recent development that people should know about, some viewers or listeners might be familiar that we have periodization of biblical Hebrew, typically classical or early biblical Hebrew, the Hebrew that we find in the Torah, the Pentateuch, and in the what's called the Deuteronomic history, the earlier prophets, the narrative prophets, as opposed to late biblical Hebrew, which we find in post-exilic works, Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, Chronicles. There's been a recent development within this kind of linguistic history of or periodization of biblical Hebrew that the linguistic profile of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, is the earliest of any book that we have in the Bible, so that it's actually a little earlier than what we generally call classical biblical Hebrew. And so therefore that's what allows me on a purely scholarly level to say that, wow, if we have a story in Genesis and we have the same story in Judges, there are probably at least a dozen, no less, a dozen markers of this early biblical Hebrew that we can find in the story in Genesis 19 that will be absent in Judges 21. Okay, so once I come with the assumption that the author of the concubine at Gibeah is invoking the story of Sodom and Lot and his daughter and everything that goes on there. Right. So towards what end? And always, I think always, the parallels that are drawn are designed to challenge the reader to see what is similar and what is dissimilar. It certainly comes on probably an immediate level. It comes to say, wow, gosh, the Israelites, they have descended so far. How far have they descended? Well, they've descended so far that they are like Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay. In fact, I think that the phrase Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the most oft repeated phrases in all of the Bible, as a kind of a reference point. Stories that are referred, that is one of the top reference that we have in the Bible, and so it fits in with that. But then there will be ways in which you can see that the Israelites are now like Sodom and Gomorrah, probably ways in which they are worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. It then challenges you to go back and reread the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe you see new things there as well. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and when you're reading the law, you will pick up in the legal material like, oh, this is the exact opposite of how you're supposed to treat foreigners who wander into your village, right? So it sparks off like what's so wrong beyond the
Yeah, it isn't just violence and terrible things like that. It's also a question of, what's really going on in Genesis 19 is issues of group identity, who's in, who's out. Yeah. What is the meaning of being out? Okay.
Right.
And then realizing, wow, this issue of in and out is what Israelite tribes are doing to one another. It isn't just, wow, there was a rape there and there's a rape here. That's true too. But it's, these codes of how do we determine who is in and who is out.
Yeah. And
which is an Israelite tragedy, right? When it comes to that.
Yeah. It is a tragedy. Okay, I think Joseph and Daniel, you have a similar situation where you have thematically. I don't think linguistically there's as much connection going on between Joseph and Daniel, but you have two guys who can interpret dreams in the court, and they do so in a very similar way. That's a strange one off the cuff. Like why does Daniel look so much like Joseph? Maybe less Abraham or something.
Right. I haven't done much about that, so I'm going to pass on that one.
You're going to punt? That's fine. Great.
Though the question is an obvious and good one. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh well, it was a real question for me because I haven't thought that much about it.
Right.
Okay, this one in the book of Exodus, we'll do two on the book of Exodus. It starts out in Exodus 1-4, and I think it's fair to say that every hero in Exodus 1-4, Moses gets a mixed review here. But the ones who are unabashedly doing the right thing, even against the legal reasoning of the day, right? They're ordered to do something and they judge that order to be wrong and act against it, is women. And then Zipporah comes in and kind of saves Moses as a foreigner who understands that he has a covenant obligation as well. So what do you make of what everybody loves to say is a patriarchal world written by elite men? Why are they putting all of these women at the beginning of Exodus? Besides the obvious, which we could say is, well, maybe that's just how the story went.
Right. I think the story of the Exodus is about upending existing and entrenched social orders. And therefore, what better way than to champion the bottom rung of the ladder, which often is women. But there could be many ways to parse this. I really like, one of my favorite chapters is Exodus 2. Right, it begins with the story of the rescue of baby Moses, and from there moves on to Moses going out to his brethren, and then seeing the first day the Egyptians smiting the Israelite, and then the second day the two Israelites going at it against one another, culminating in the story of Moses at the well with the daughters of Jethro. And I just love the role how gender plays itself out across this story. That what you see is the following, is that in the first episode, the rescue of baby Moses, you have many figures that are there. They're all women. In other words, the men are conspicuously absent. Moses' father is not in the story. Pharaoh is not in the story. Though you do have the sister, and you have Pharaoh's daughter, and you have her maidservants. Okay, that there are paintings of all these women. There's several really amazing paintings that all give very interesting interpretations from European masterpieces about this story. And what you see is that the first story is that it's all women, except for Moses, but he's not really much of a player in that story, right? He's too little. Then in the second story, when Moses goes out, you see just the opposite. That you see it's all men, right? Moses is now big, and he sees an Egyptian man smiting an Israelite man, and then two Israelite men smiting one another, and then Pharaoh who wants to smite Moses. And what you see here is how gender is kind of upended, because in the first story, what's really happening is that all these women are putting their neck out. Every single one of them is complicit in saving this Israelite baby who, by royal fiat, should be drowned. And so they are all actually demonstrating bravery, but at the same time, they are demonstrating what verse 6 says there, "Vatachmol alav," she had compassion on him, right? So this ultimate virtue of women, of pity and compassion, but melded together with true bravery. Whereas in the second story, where it's all men, well, why are they all killing each other? Because they're all threatened by one another. They're all afraid of each other.
Yeah.
And so, it's just so fascinating how you can see you have the best of women in their compassion, which expresses itself in bravery. And then you have all these men who are very violent, but that's an expression of their fear. And then you have the third story, which is Moses at the well, and the girls come home, and their report to Jethro, they say, an Egyptian man delivered us from the shepherds, and he also went and drew water and gave water to the sheep. Now, why do they say that? In other words, you would expect they would say, "Wow, Abba, Daddy, wow, there was this guy and he saved us." That afterwards he gave water to the sheep. Why is that worthy of note? And I think that what they're saying is that they see all of these aspects in Moses. That on the one hand, he's a guy, he can go rock'em sock'em with the best of them, right? But what makes him amazing is that he's not just a typical Rambo. He's actually got a big heart. And when he's finished with settling the account with the shepherds, wow, he then went and took water and went and gave water to the sheep. He's the best of men and the best of women. So this is how gender becomes a very rich issue in that story.
Okay, while I have you in this story, one more question that has puzzled me a little bit, I think. The same phrase is used, and the Pharaoh sought to kill or smite Moses. And then chapter 4, on their way back in, exact same phrase, and Adonai sought to kill Moses. And so you have Moses' life in danger twice, once from Pharaoh, once from God himself. What do you make of that?
I hadn't thought about that. Moses has a lot of enemies. Yeah, I mean, look, that whole story there in chapter 4, as there's a phrase in Hebrew, the sequestered is greater than the revealed, meaning there are more questions than good answers from that story. So I'm not really sure what to say about it.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, then I feel better about being a little perplexed.
Yeah. So it's a mysterious story, the whole thing.
Yeah. I would love to hear what you think the purpose of poetry embedded in narrative is. And the example I came up with was Exodus 14 and 15, which is just for all kinds of reasons, a very interesting interplay between the poetry and narrative. But why do we have a song telling us what we just saw?
Right. And sometimes in some ways contradicting it and adding to it. Yeah. Yeah. So let me say that within biblical Hebrew, there is no word for prose and there is no word for poetry. Okay. These are anachronistic categories that we impose upon the biblical text. Okay. I will tell you that Egyptians did this all the time. They have stories and suddenly someone bursts out in song in the middle of a story. And does just this. I mean, there's a famous work, the Kaddish inscriptions of Ramses II. Particularly, one of them is called the Kaddish poem, where it's a long description of his greatest achievement, the battle against the Hittites, the Hittite Empire in 1274 BCE, at the city of Kaddish on the Orontes River, and there's a long narrative account, what we would recognize, or we would categorize as a prose account, and then suddenly it breaks out into song and retells many of the same things, sometimes a little bit differently, and nobody said boo about this. And it is absolutely for sure that those were commissioned by one and the same agent. Right. That's what's also important, that the difference in genre does not necessarily imply a multiple authorship. Just like in the Code of Hammurabi, there's a prologue, there's an epilogue, and then you have the laws in the middle. And the prologue and the epilogue each have their own genre. They're different from one another and obviously different from the laws themselves. But it's clear that Hammurabi is the one, I don't know if he wrote it, but he certainly commissioned it. And no one ever thought, wait, this doesn't cohere. That's our problem.
Maybe for our listeners to say what you're not saying, which is, it is a standard practice in biblical scholarship to look at these differences and then immediately begin looking at, well, maybe these are two different sources from two different. From centuries apart with different theological agendas.
Yes. This is one of my big bones, as you know, Drew, that to be sensitive and I would say critical readers, we have to have the keys to the car. What does that mean? We have to know how ancients thought and wrote. You can't just, get into the car in 2025 and start to drive. You know what I mean? You can't just say, well, this is what seems to make sense to me. Well, me, I'm a product of a certain time and place, and we are, the long heirs of a tradition of how to read from Aristotle. Even if you never read the Poetics, that's the air that you and I breathe, and everybody who grew up in the West, speaking English and being trained the way you and I were. So it requires a little bit of removing the sands of time and recovering to the best that we can. And now we really can. Go read those Egyptian texts, and then suddenly things don't look as strange in that context. One of the things that comes out is this mixing of narrative and of poetry, what we would call narrative and poetry. I don't think the Egyptians had a word for it either. Their capacity to withstand or tolerate what we would call contradiction. I don't think they saw it that way at all. Right. They saw things as having multiple aspects to them, and there's no problem with describing the same event two different ways. It's all good.
And do you think that, in some way, does that implicate this understanding that, you know, 5 people witness something, they're all going to have a slightly different version of it, and that's just the way it goes. Or when you move this, what we would call narrative, into poetry, or we don't know which way it started with, that there's always a loss or a perspectival shift that makes more sense in poetry than it makes in narrative.
I don't think it's not the issue of the 5 different people standing in 5 different places. The text wants to tell you about different aspects of it, of a certain thing.
Okay.
Why? Well, yeah.
No, that makes sense, and it's difficult to describe to people outside of biblical studies how strong the tendency is to divide up text and put them in different centuries and in different places and combine in different. So you're giving it a chance to just say, well, maybe somebody wanted these to be read together and put them together as they were writing, or put the song next to it from Finally, I would love it if you would share, to the degree that you're comfortable sharing, I would love for you to share about your work taking people down to Egypt. I think it would be surprising to a lot of people that you take large groups of Jewish people from Israel and other places.
I used
down
to.
Egypt. Yeah, you used to, and
I hope to
do it again. But what started that? How did you get into it? And how did that work with a bunch of like religious Jewish people? So in Egypt.
Yeah, right. So, well, one of my great inspirations is my dear friend and colleague and mentor, James Hoffmeyer, who's an Egyptologist and also an Old Testament scholar. And from his work and from little dabblings that I had done in some Egyptological material, I always had a fascination with Egypt, and that's where it all begins. And I really wanted to see Egypt, but I didn't want to just go and look at pyramids. I wanted to go with somebody who could, explain to me all these inscriptions and things that we see on the walls all over. And Professor Hoffmeyer was leading a tour. He leads a tour every winter, and it's for scholars and pastors. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll join that. That's good. I'll have a whole bodyguard crew of Christian scholars and pastors. That's good. If I'm wearing a skull cap, then that's a good thing.
Right.
I'll be in good shape. This was in January of 2021, at the height of COVID. There was nobody in Egypt other than us, practically. And when it was finished, I was so totally blown away by what I had learned and what I had seen. And I thought to myself, wow, one day when the Messiah comes, I really have to bring Jews here to see all this stuff. And we'll walk around Egypt with Bible in hand in the footsteps of the Exodus, literally. And how every passage, one passage after another in the Bible, just suddenly bursts out in color when you look at something on the wall and you understand what the connection is. And then after that, I was sipping a latte with Hoffmeyer on the banks of the Nile, and about an hour later, I thought, well, maybe we don't need to wait for the Messiah. And then in 22 and 23, I took 2 groups each year, and we went, and it was mind blowing. I never had any problems with anything anti-Semitic. 8 months before the war broke out, I was with a group in February of 23. In Egypt, and I was in a museum in Cairo, and I was approached by an Arab man, I guess about 40 years old, and he says to me, "Are you from Israel?" Because I walk around with my skull cap on. That's just what I do. I don't want to. If I have to hide it, I don't want to be there. And I said, "Well, yes, I am." And he said to me, "I'm from Gaza." He said, "My name is Hisham." This was on a Sunday. Okay, this is important. You'll see. He says, "My name is Hisham, and I want to tell you that I hate Hamas, and I think that we should be making peace with you. And as far as yesterday was concerned, Shabbat Shalom."
Wow.
That's what he said to me.
Wow.
That's what he said. So, yes, your question was well-founded. It's not always so easy or maybe even so wise to be so visibly Jewish in some places. And then, the most surprising things can happen as well. And I'm kind of, hitting myself that I didn't keep up the connection with him. I have no idea what's with this man. Is he alive? Is he under rubble? I have no idea. I don't know. But, I think it is a testimony to the fact that maybe there is some hope. There is, some opportunity for optimism that, it's not all one color. Maybe there are some that are stronger. Maybe there's a louder voice. But, this guy came over to me out of his own free will to tell me this. I suspect, at least then, he wasn't the only one that felt that way. What's going to be now? May the Lord help us. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you very much for sharing that. It was very encouraging to me, and I can't wait until those tours can start up again.
Hey, that would be great to have you, Drew. Wow.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right, Dr. Joshua Berman, thank you very much for your time, and as always, your wisdom.
Okay, wow. Thank you, Drew, and friends at home. Blessings and greetings from the Holy Land. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.